to us in this world. We ask that you be with us as we learn about another woman who has done so much to help this world become a better place, has a woman who has recognized social injustice and has done something about it. We hope that in this Lenten time that this inspiration of her life will make it better for us to be able to recognize our own gifts and go out and use them for the betterment of the rest of the world. Amen. As I said, this is a Lenten series of the Episcopal Women's History Project. EWIP, as we are called, is here to tell women's stories and record them for posterity. We hope that this series has inspired you so far and that will continue to inspire you to join us and be part of that mission statement. Today we will hear about Pauli Murray from Senator Kim Jackson. Senator Jackson represents District 4, which includes DeKalb and Gwinnett counties in the Georgia State Senate. Growing up in the rural South, Kim made her home in Georgia 10 years ago. She graduated from Candler School of Theology and was ordained an Episcopal priest. She's always been an advocate for social justice, serving as college chaplain, consultant, preacher, and parish priest. Today, as the vicar of the Church of the Common Ground, she ministers to people and who minister to her also, who are experiencing homelessness in downtown Atlanta. She and her spouse live on a small urban farm in Stone Mountain. We thank Senator Jackson for taking time to be with us to hear about Pauli Murray, who, like her, advocated for social justice. Senator Jackson, I turn it to you.
Well, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you all so much for having me. It's really an honor to be able to be here with you all to talk about Pauli Murray, who is, for me, definitely someone who I think has shaped and formed my own life. And I feel very much like I stand on her shoulders and her legacy. And so we'll talk a little bit about that along the way and about the ways that my own story and journey as an Episcopal priest, as a Black queer Episcopal priest, has intersected with Pauli Murray's life as well. So I'm going to take a moment here and I'm going to share my screen as we kind of walk through a little bit about Pauli Murray. So here we go. So Pauli Murray, her life began in 1910 in a time in which women had definitely not been ordained, in a time in which what it meant to be a woman meant that there were a lot of restrictions. And even still, born in that time, Pauli had a real great sense of justice. And so many people, our own presiding bishop has talked about this, have talked about the way that Pauli really understood kind of where this country could go many, many years before we were able to move that way. She was already thinking about women's rights and LGBTQ rights way in advance of where this country moved. So Pauli Murray, over broad speaking, who was Pauli Murray? She was an Episcopal priest, which ironically, I probably should have put that last because that happened in the later part of her years. Before becoming a priest, she was an advocate and an activist, a lawyer. She was an intersectional feminist. And when I use that language, I'm talking about she was the kind of feminist who understood that race and class and gender identity have something to say about feminism, that feminism alone, and over time, she really tried to press this home that For so many, feminism was really just talking about white women. But because she was an intersectional feminist, she understood that we had to talk about issues of race and class as they impacted women as well. She is an author, or was an author, published a number of books, her own autobiographies, and because she was a lawyer and a brilliant mind, there were a number of legal books and legal essays that she also published. She's a queer icon. And the reality is that during her lifetime, from 1910 to 1985, that's not the language that she would have used. And, it's interesting, even the conversation about what pronouns I use for Pauli Murray. There was a time and a phase in Pauli Murray's life where Pauli went by she/he. We believe that if Pauli were alive today, Pauli may even have used gender non-binary terms of like they. But for those of us who are a part of the LGBT community, we certainly understand that she is a queer icon, and she's a civil rights activist. And I think that during Women's History Month, it's really important that we lift up and highlight women who were part of the civil rights movement, because oftentimes the iconic pictures that we see are those of, the Dr. Martin Luther King, it's the John Lewises, it's the men, it's the Black men who were a part of this. But Pauli Murray was, in her own right, an incredible civil rights activist, and really gave us some of the great brilliance that helped advance this country around issues of race and integration. I just want to talk a little bit about her early life. Because these things are particular to Pauli, and she actually writes about these in her autobiography. She grew up and she was actually raised by her Aunt Pauline. So her parents kind of sent her away and separated her from her siblings. And she was raised by her Aunt Pauline, who was a school teacher. And the way that Pauli Murray tells the story in her autobiography is that her aunt took her to the class, so the classroom where her aunt was teaching. It's like a third grade classroom, but Pauli was just a kindergartner and understood everything that was already happening. So she was a child who displayed great brilliance and great intellect at a very, very early age. And her Aunt Pauline understood that and really tried to stoke that and cultivate that. At the same time, Pauli was also, even at that young age, beginning to wrestle with her identity as it related to conforming with certain social norms as it relates to being a girl. So Pauli, growing up in the 1910s and 20s, as a girl should have been, according to social norms, wearing dresses and skirts. And Pauli wanted no part in that. And her Aunt Pauline actually supported that and allowed Pauli to wear pants and gave her a lot of freedoms that many of us perhaps would not instill in an 8-year-old, to kind of go out and do her own thing. Pauli got a job when she was when she was not yet even a teenager, because she was just she was so smart and independent, and her Aunt Pauline really did trust her to make those good decisions. Now, the other thing I'll say about her Aunt Pauline, and I hope those of you who are on this call who are aunties or mothers or friends, Aunt Pauline remained an incredible influencer in Pauli Murray's life for the entirety of Aunt Pauline's life. As Pauli Murray continued to age and develop and really wrestle with these internal struggles that she had around her sexual identity, her sexual orientation, and her gender identity, it was her Aunt Pauline that she would write to and talk about, I'm really wrestling with these things. And her Aunt Pauline was a safe place to do that. And so I want to highlight and lift up the real importance of people having a safe auntie to call on when they're wrestling with things that perhaps one's contemporaries would frown upon, right? I mean, Pauli Murray was growing up in a time when the idea of being in love with a woman was definitely frowned upon, but her Aunt Pauline was a safe place for her to talk about that. And Pauline, we know about this because Pauline wrote letters and she saved those letters. I think so that you and I would be able to have these kinds of conversations. In her adult life, Pauli Murray found herself at Hunter College in New York, which now it takes men and women. It's a co-ed school, but at the time that she went, it was an all-women's school, and Pauli Murray actually was oftentimes the only Black woman in the classroom. And so she tells this story, and you don't have to read this, I'll just tell it for you. Pauli Murray talks about having had a wonderful experience at Hunter College, with one exception. She was in an American history class, and the professor in that class told a kind of American history that essentially eliminated all of the contributions that African Americans, or as Pauli would have said in that time, that Negroes had contributed to this country. The way that she talked about slavery, the way she talked about civil rights movement, the Civil War and Reconstruction, it essentially made Pauli invisible as a Black woman. And, Pauli Murray talks about how even though she wasn't able to, in that moment, speak up in that class, and she basically kind of withdrew into herself as a protective mechanism, that was the moment, though, that sparked in her a real desire to understand, to learn, and to know what she calls Negro history, or what we would call today African American history. And it lit within Pauli Murray a real spark to fight towards activism and to seek justice, particularly as it pertained to race issues. And so that experience was incredibly formative to Pauli Murray. And I think we have Pauli Murray today in part because somebody told a really poor version of history. And instead of Pauli accepting that version, she pushed on. Pauli pressed forward and said, no, I know something more, and we're gonna deal with that. Pauli Murray has a long and complicated life when it comes to her relationships, with romantic relationships. Pauli was married to a man very briefly, and she dedicates all of like one paragraph to even talking about it. It was extraordinarily brief. It basically didn't happen, and instead had a number of romantic relationships with women. And I will say that Pauli wrestled with that for their entire life, that not really understanding why she felt, or why they felt attracted to women, to heterosexual women especially. Pauli, because this was a time in which the concept of being trans just was not a thing in the 1950s for Pauli to really explore, right? But she even went to doctors and asked them to help her understand why did she feel like she was a man? When there was Pauli had an appendectomy at one point, and they asked that, while you're in here like dealing with my appendix, can you just check inside to see, like, do I have male parts inside of me? Because I can't understand why I have these feelings, why I have these desires. And so just continue to really wrestle with that, because there just wasn't space. I think there wasn't space in society for Pauli to be non-binary, for Pauli to be a trans man. And there wasn't space theologically at that time. And Pauli was a woman of deep faith. She'd grown up in church. Her grandmother was an Episcopalian, who was a Black kid who went to Episcopal church in North Carolina. And as Black people in the South at that time were forced to do, sat in the balcony of an Episcopal church. And so faith was of deep significance to Pauli Murray. And yet this issue around her sexual orientation just really haunted her, and she couldn't necessarily make those two things fit together very well. And yet even still, she pressed on and had really important, loving relationships with people, with women. And when those relationships would end, I mean, one particular, when her partner died, the ending of that relationship was extraordinarily devastating to Pauli Murray. And Pauli ended up having to be institutionalized for deep depression. We understand that a lot of that wrestling around sexual orientation probably was probably contributed to her several bouts of depression. And yet still, she pressed on and did really amazing things. And so I want to just highlight the ways that Pauli was resilient, and that when she needed help, she went and received the help that she needed from doctors in order to continue to live into her calling. So let me tell you a little bit about what that calling looked like. So for Pauli Murray, she went to Hunter, and then she found herself, she actually applied to law school. She applied to Harvard Law School, but Harvard told her that she was a woman and therefore could not go. So I'm sure, I promise you today, they regret that. So then she ended up at Howard University, which is an HBCU, and she was there in 1944. But as you can note from this picture, she was the only she in that class. She was one of the only women, the only woman in a class of all men. And that's when Pauli really began to understand the consequences of what it meant to be a woman in a man's world, for lack of a better term. So, she went to this women's college. So being at the women's college, everything was cool. Like, women were in charge. She had women teachers. And so then when she was in that women's college, the issue was around race, right? She experienced racism, but there wasn't really the gender issue. But when she showed up at Howard University, she understood that by virtue of her being a woman, she was blocked out of conversations. They would have these gatherings for first year attorneys, and but they would make them male only. So she was the only woman there, so really they made them poly excluded gatherings, right? And that's when I think really Pauli began to really try to think intersectionally and talk about the ways that both race and gender impact people's lives. It was also at Howard University where Pauli had one of the most important legal understandings that has changed the trajectory of the United States. When we talk about Brown versus Board of Education, which is what led to the desegregation of our schools, we often talk about Thurgood Marshall because he was the one who prosecuted that case or made that case to the Supreme Court. But the actual legal mind behind that was Pauli Murray. In Pauli's third year, senior year of law school, Pauli wrote about the inherent inequality in this notion of separation, of separate but equal. So the law of the land at the time was Plessy v. Ferguson, which was basically, as long as you have, you could have a separate white school and a separate Black school, as long as they're equal. And Pauli wrote about that's just not possible. That the very notion of separateness is inherently unequal. And her fellow classmates who we're looking at on the screen and her professors, they laughed at her. They thought that her argument was just not realistic. And they understood at the time that segregation was going to be our only chance for prosperity as Black people. But what we know is just a mere 10 years later, Thurgood Marshall took that very writing that she had and went to the Supreme Court to make the argument that separate but equal is inherently unequal. And so we have Pauli Murray to thank for that legislation, for that court decision that made it possible for me to be able to go to the schools that I went to. I want to just take a moment and share with you a little video clip here from of blessed memory, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, because she'll tell a little bit more about Pauli Murray's influence on her as it relates to issues around women's rights. So give me 1 second here, I will share that. Can you all see that screen? Did the screen change for you all? Do you see Ruth Bader Ginsburg? No, okay. Thank you. Somebody is helping me in the back end here. All right, we're going to try that again. Okay. Here we go. Here's Ruth Bader Ginsburg of blessed memory.
Did you see the picture of Pauli Murray's class at Howard with the lone woman? When did I first become aware of Pauli Murray? In the summer of 1958. I was engaged as a summer associate in a law firm, and I was taken to meet the lone woman associate, Pauli Murray. I thought she was remarkable. She had written the book about her family, Proud Shoes, and I had read that, so I knew a little bit about Pauli. My closest affiliation with her was when she was on the board of the ACLU. I saw her working at her office in Paul Weiss, but that was just fleeting as I was going down the corridor. The 14th Amendment contains my favorite clause of the Constitution, nor shall any state deny any person the equal protection of the laws. Pauli had the idea that we should interpret the text literally. It said any person, not any male person. She wrote this remarkable article called Jane Crow and the Law, where she called attention to all the laws that restricted what women could do. But unlike race discrimination, they were all rationalized as favors for the ladies. For example, women were not permitted to serve on juries. It was thought that would distract them from their responsibility at home. The idea of Jane Crow was to show that classifications dividing the world up that way were not benign. They did not operate benignly in women's favor. Years later, Justice Brennan put it very well. He said, the pedestal on which women were thought to stand, more often than not, turns out to be a cage. Reed v. Reed was the turning point gender discrimination case in the Supreme Court.
Next is number 4, Reed against Reed.
Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing so that you all can watch more of that later, but I wanted you to hear just a bit about Pauli Murray and the ways that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was inspired by Pauli's legal mind. You know, so often, I think this is true for Black women, we do really incredible things that go unseen. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg saw, and we all know Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right? But so many of us didn't get to know the name of Pauli Murray until really recently. And I believe that's in part because Pauli Murray was Black. Let me continue my share of my, I don't know how to share this again. I'm going to continue with my PowerPoint here. So just to continue, so Pauli Murray came up with this really incredible point around the reasons why Jane Crow was ultimately a cage and hurt us and really did help to transform issues around women's rights. They also helped to establish and create the National Organization of Women as an effort to continue to promote women's rights. And things in this country as a Black person were hard and challenging. And so Pauli actually took 18 months off and went to Ghana, where they didn't have to deal with racial discrimination, and was really able to get back in touch with their roots and just kind of escape, I mean, remember what time we're talking about. We're talking about 1950s, early 1960s, being Black in America, not that it's necessarily easy now, but that was a particularly tumultuous time to be Black. And so Pauli was able to take 18 months off to go to Ghana and to teach about ideals around democracy and women's rights. Unfortunately, the folks in Ghana didn't necessarily take too well for her ideas about democracy either. And so Pauli found themselves returning to these United States. And I don't know if you all have read anything about Pauli in the news in the last couple of years, you'll know that there's now a building named after Pauli Murray, and that's because Pauli went to Yale University for higher education. Note that Pauli chose a different Ivy League school than the original one, since they would not admit her, and found themselves at Yale. And now, in celebration of Pauli's life and their influence, Yale University has named a building after Pauli. You know, later in life, so Pauli spent a significant amount of her time teaching, which you might note the influence of her aunt, and who was a teacher, her Aunt Pauli. Pauli Murray spent a lot of time really honing her craft as a teacher, as a legal scholar, and as a person who just wasn't willing to back down around when it came to issues of discrimination. And so Pauli was just as quick to write a brilliant piece, what we would call now a think piece, was just as quick to do that as they were just as quick to put on their shoes and go marching. I think it's really important to note that Pauli Murray sat down in a bus, in the white section of a bus, a full 15 years before Rosa Parks. And so that's, you know, a part of Pauli Murray's story, is that she's always just been ahead of her time and really understanding the importance of breaking down these barriers, of breaking down barriers between what it is to be male or female, breaking down barriers of what it is to be Black and white. Pauli sat down and was arrested for sitting down in the white section of a bus in 1940, a full 15 years before Rosa Parks. Late in life, in her 70s, Pauli Murray found herself, I guess late 60s and 70s, found herself feeling called to ministry. And she writes about this in her autobiography, and she talks about how it was actually a surprise. So I suspect there are people, in fact, I know there are people on this call who remember well the arguments and debates that the Episcopal Church had around whether or not we should ordain women. And Pauli Murray, as a layperson, had been involved in some of those ad hoc groups talking about whether or not women should be called to ministry. But for the most part, that wasn't what they were thinking about for their own life. But as God sometimes does, God is always full of surprises. And Pauli Murray found themselves in seminary, and actually went to seminary before it was quite, you know, we had those irregular ordinations. So before it was regular to ordain female priests, Pauli went ahead and went to seminary. And then after seminary was in fact ordained. And she tells this really beautiful story about their ordination. And I think it's one that, if there are other priests on this call, that many of us will understand in some ways. Pauli talks about the day before their ordination. There was this overwhelming sense of like, oh my goodness, am I doing the right thing? And because women's ordination was so new, and there were still, I mean, Pauli had sat through all of the arguments about why women shouldn't be ordained, and the ways that people use biblical scriptures to say that women shouldn't be ordained. Well, on the night before her ordination, she remembered every one of those debates, all of those arguments, and she had that overwhelming sense of, wait, maybe this isn't right. What if this isn't right? And I will say, as a Black queer woman who was raised in a tradition that said that queer people, that LGBT folks should not be ordained, I certainly understand what it is to be that night before your ordination and wonder, what if those other people were right? What if the people who said that women shouldn't be ordained, what if they're right? What if the people who said that people being gay, you shouldn't be ordained, what if they're right? And Pauli talks about, she had a friend who said, I was afraid that God was just going to strike me down dead by lightning, if I stood up there and did it. But the beauty of Pauli Murray's story is that as she was kneeling to be ordained and to have hands laid upon her, she was in the National Cathedral, and Pauli writes about how suddenly the sun kind of broke through the glass, and there was just this shatter of rainbow lit glass that came through, and it was so powerful that the congregation audibly gasped at the beauty of this sun breaking through in that moment. And for Pauli, that was the sign, right? That this is good, that God approves. And thus Pauli became our first Black ordained Episcopal priest in this church. I want to conclude my remarks actually with Pauli's words, and I'll take questions, and there's more that I can say, but I want to conclude with these words, and I'm going to let you see my face while I read these to you. This is speaking of her ordination, and this is late in her life, and Pauli says, all of the strands of my life came together, descendant of a slave and a descendant of a slave owner. I had already been called a poet, a lawyer, a teacher, and a friend, but upon being ordained, now I was empowered to minister the sacrament of the one in whom there is no north or south, no Black or white, no male nor female, only the spirit of love and reconciliation, drawing us all towards the goal of human wholeness. Indeed, that is what it is to be a priest in God's church, one able to offer the gift of reconciliation. Even when there have been parties and people who have rejected you and said that you don't belong, Pauli was able to administer the sacraments to Black and white, to queer and straight, a sign and symbol of God's love and reconciliation for us all. So with that, I certainly would welcome any questions that you all may have.
If you do have any questions, would you write them in the chat room? And until that happens, I hope, Kim, you'll just continue to tell some stories. I have a question. Did your path ever cross personally with Pauli Murray?
No, Pauli Murray died in 1985, and I was just born.
Ooh, okay.
So no, unfortunately, our paths did not cross in life. But I will say, this is kind of my own personal story. So, Pauli Murray was, I don't know if people know, Pauli Murray actually ran for office once. And when it was time for my own swearing in to the Georgia Senate, where I am the first and only LGBTQ state senator in Georgia, I wanted to know that the saints were with me. And so I actually wore a stole from Pauli Murray at my swearing in as a clear and visible symbol of her presence with me, and that I stand in her legacy. So while I did not meet her in person in real life, I'm very much aware of her presence as a saint in my life.
Thank you. We have a question from Nancy Crawford. What was Pauli's ministry after ordination? Parish priest?
Yeah, Pauli was actually fairly aged by the time, and so I think Pauli spent some time serving as a clergy person, but I don't know that she was ever a rector or anything like that. I'm looking at Nan Pete, who I know is on this call, because Nan would know for sure, but I do not think that Pauli ever served in that kind of traditional way. Nan will, I think she's going to write in the chat, but yeah, that was my understanding. Mostly she did supply.
Let's see, Margaret Hardy says, has anyone looked into whether Aunt Pauline could have been gay?
Oh, that's a really great question. I have not read about that. I don't know. That would be interesting. Yeah. I think what we do know for sure is that Aunt Pauline did not conform to, or did not feel the need to force Polly to conform to this, to conform to the social constructs of that day. And so I don't know if Aunt Pauline herself was gay, but I do know that she at least had some more liberal thoughts around what it means to be a girl growing up. So yeah, that's a really great question. I don't know.
And Patricia Marks is curious to know how you first learned about her.
Yeah, so I first learned about Pauli Murray because I went looking for, as a seminarian, I wanted to know were there other Black queer Episcopal priests. You know, at the time, I didn't know any other LGBTQ Black, particularly female priests. I knew actually some Black gay men, but it was just really important for me to know somebody who was out and serving in a congregation. And interestingly, before I could find a person who was alive and in the flesh, the first name when I asked at the seminary that came up was, well, there was Pauli Murray. And I began to immediately delve into and to learn her story more because she's just so amazingly incredible, right? And to see that not only was she, you know, the first Black priest, that she was also in these same-sex marriages, but also that she was just this brilliant legal scholar who very much understood that as a person of faith, I mean, that's the thing we really need to name here, is that, you know, her approach to these issues around equality came out of a deep sense of faith that God has created us all as equal, that we are all God's children. And so I really resonated with her sense and call to justice as well.
I'd like to ask if Nan Pete would be willing to share. Nan says that she has met her on 2 different occasions.
Yes, Joanne, can you
Yes,
hear me?
would you tell
Thank you,
about
Tim. When I went to seminary, at General Seminary, Pauli, because she had gone to General, came up each year and, you know, spent time at the seminary. And we would sit and talk, and she was one of my classmates from the Diocese of LA was having a really hard time. And he was an African-American and gay, but that time was still really closeted, but was having a difficult time. And she went and was his advocate. And we talked about it, and she talked about her experiences and what she'd done. And, you know, and Dana ended up getting ordained, not out of LA, but out of Newark. But yeah, she was small. I mean, she was, I don't think she was 5 feet. She may have been 5 feet, and but she had a presence that was awesome. I mean, she was twice her size. I mean, you know, she could fill up a room being this small person and not just say anything, but just being who she was. And she cared deeply about other people. You know, justice for her was about, love was about justice. And if you didn't treat everybody equally, then, you know, that's how she saw her Christian vocation, living it out. And she also said that being a priest brought all parts of her life together. You know, what she had done as a lawyer and all, you know, it was like full circle. And that was helpful to me because I was a second career person too. And it was like, you know, for such a time as this, she was born. Mm-hmm. But she served at that time, she was serving as an assistant in Baltimore. I think it was because a friend of mine went after, when he finished seminary, he went to serve in that same parish. Holy Communion, Holy Evangelist, I don't remember which one, but she served. I mean, it wasn't a full-time parish, but, you know, because they couldn't afford it. But yes, I was privileged to know her. Not know her, but be around her for the time she would come up to the seminary.
And you had said in the chat that she served a parish in Baltimore. And
Yes.
Betty Lane said mostly she did supply work.
Yeah.
And Charlene Wiltshire says that I think she had an affiliation with St. Titus Episcopal Church in North Carolina.
So I will say Pauli Murray came back. She was ordained in the National Cathedral, right? But she celebrated her first Eucharist in the Chapel of the Holy Cross in North Carolina, which is her family church.
Yes.
And in so doing, became the first woman to celebrate the Eucharist in North Carolina. So I know that she had a affiliation, a strong long-term affiliation, just by a family. To the Chapel of the Holy Cross.
Yeah.
And someone else, Susan Middlestat would like to know if we have a last name for Aunt Pauline.
I don't. I was looking at her book. I don't know her last name at the time right now. Somebody else, I know Betty Lane is clearly an expert on Pauli Lane who answers all the questions. So hopefully Betty Lane will be able to provide that.
Aunt Pauline Dane is what she says. Thank you, Betty. Okay, does anyone else have, someone made a comment that her life is not unlike the African-American woman priest that was celebrated last Saturday, Barbara Harris.
Yeah.
They have a lot in common, don't they?
They really do, for sure. In many ways, actually. Think about the smallness of Bishop Barbara Harris too, but physically, how small and petite Bishop Barbara Harris was as well, and yet such a large presence as well. So, but many things in common.
Yes. Also, I have read a book about the friendship of her and Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yeah,
Would you be able to say anything about that?
Yeah, so I'm not actually sure why I left that out. It's clearly in my notes, but a long-term friendship, a writing relationship. This is actually how we know a lot about Pauli Murray's because, well, she left all of her papers. I think Pauli Murray understood. It seems very clear to me that Pauli understood that at some point people would recognize the value and the legacy that they had to offer to this world, because Pauli made sure that we got all of her papers and letters to verify that. So I'm very grateful for that. But yes, they were friends. They wrote, in fact, Eleanor Roosevelt's husband wrote Harvard to try to get them to let her in, and still to no avail. So they had a long-standing relationship that was really beautiful. And if you get a chance to read those letters and correspondences, I encourage people to check them out.
And it was so interesting to me how they got together, that Pauli was apparently she was homeless in New York, is that correct? And that Eleanor Roosevelt had created a retreat home for homeless women. And Pauli got there somehow, and it helped her out of it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things about, I think, these intersections between being Black and a woman and in that particular time period, but also that even though Pauli Murray was brilliant and so incredibly talented and helped create so much that honestly, all of us women on this call today have benefited from her greatness and brilliance. She actually lived in poverty and close to poverty for a significant portion of her life. And so that's something for us to remember. And I will say, I think her closeness to poverty probably helped inspire her to continue to push to break some of these barriers, because ultimately, she understood, I think really understood the struggle in a way that perhaps other people wouldn't.
Lynn Hoke has reminded us to look online for the Pauli Murray Project in Durham, where they've been at hard work for a decade getting the house ready and restored for to be a centerpiece of history and education. And I know they've had a hard time getting money, so I guess anybody who has an extra dollar or two, they'd appreciate the help.
Yeah. I will say that I saw in the chat somebody asked me about the phrase queer, and I think it's Tula. Says that I use the term queer to describe Pauli and my own sexuality. How did I come to use that specific term as compared to LGBTQ? So, I mean, LGBTQ, the Q in LGBTQ is queer, but I choose to use that particularly for Pauli because Pauli doesn't ever say that she's lesbian. Pauli doesn't ever say that they're trans, right? Like, Pauli doesn't use those words. Pauli had romantic relationships with women and really struggled with those. So I think for me, I don't want to necessarily put a very specific narrow term like lesbian or, Pauli was married to a man very, very briefly. So I don't want to put bisexual on her. I think that it's a much more holistic term, and to use the term queer to describe their life and their romantic relationships as opposed to some of the more narrow terms. But, and just like for a point of information, I think that many people today, younger folks perhaps in my generation, we use the term queer as kind of the umbrella term instead of all the letters, but that queer is this kind of broader term that speaks to any number of people who exist within the broader LGBTQ community.
Any more questions or anything that I have, as the chat goes up, I might have missed one. And if I missed it, I apologize, and please remind us. As I say, Joan Gunderson makes the comment that Eleanor Roosevelt sent Pauli flowers for her graduation from Howard. I know they had a dear relationship.
Yeah. I see somebody's asking about Pauli's identity as a poet. Pauli published a book of poems. I think there maybe can be 2 out there, but that was a form of writing that she very much enjoyed and put out there often. And so obviously, I mean, in her final words in her own autobiography, like, she identifies as a poet and began that work early. So some of Pauli's in her earlier life, her publications were poetry. We have the benefit of her autobiography that comes, at near the end of her life, essentially a song in a weary throat. But long before those autobiography, Pauli wrote poetry, really, really beautiful poetry.
Yes, and somebody wrote this, let's see, Patricia Marks. Thank you. I'm proud to have you representing all of us in Georgia. And I'm not in Georgia, but I can say I'm proud that you're in there too, fighting the good fight. And it's John Lewis's, what is his term? Not good fight, good trouble.
It's good trouble. Good trouble. Good trouble.
I know you're doing good trouble in the Senate there, and it's so needed and so appreciated.
Yeah, well, thank you all for the opportunity to talk about this just incredible person. I was on a podcast out of North Carolina, which is, Pauli's home state, and talked about they're looking for like the next Pauli, and there is not a next Pauli, but I do very much know that I stand in her legacy, and every day as I try to make decisions down here in the Georgia State Senate, I'm trying to do them through a lens that is intersectional, through a lens that is aware of issues of poverty and of race and of injustice. I'm trying to do justice to Pauli and to the legacy that I stand in. And so I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity to share a bit about her life. If you're interested in learning more about her, her autobiography, A Song in a Weary Throat, is where most of this information about her actually comes from. But it's really beautiful, and it's just a full telling of her life in her own words. And so I do encourage you all to check that out if you're interested in learning more about her.
Thank you. And we have a couple of minutes. If you wouldn't mind, can you tell us something about what you're going through in the Senate right now? What's happening and how you're dealing with it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think Georgia has made the national news. Perhaps you guys are, you all are fairly aware that we have had a number. The number is so high now, I don't even begin to quote how many bills that are supposed to be fixing our voter system have been introduced, but they are substantial. And essentially, these bills make it more difficult for people to vote. And so here in the Senate, you know, my job, we are in the minority, well, my party, I want to try to keep this nonpartisan as I can, but those of us who are interested in maintaining access to the ballot box are in the minority. And so our strategy has been to continue to raise the important questions about is this logical? You know, so they wanted to get rid of souls to the polls, which is really, they wanted to get rid of Sunday voting. But that's when souls to the polls happens, which is this whole movement. I don't know if you guys do this in other states, but in Georgia, when we have Sunday voting, Black churches all across the state, when they get out, they'll get on buses and people will go down to the polls, souls will go to the polls, and they will vote as a part of their civic duty and as a part of their kind of Christian duty, right? And so, you know, our job has been to raise that and say, you know, why are you getting rid of Sunday voting? Is that targeted towards African Americans because you know it? That's who uses it. And then they have to answer that question, but of course they don't quite answer that question. And our role really has been to simply amplify and to get more people to pay attention to what's happening, because unfortunately we are the minority. And I think another thing that I'm trying to do down here is to also help encourage people to stay engaged. So in Georgia, people felt like we did this incredible thing because we elected Raphael Warnock, Reverend Raphael Warnock from Martin Luther King's church. And yeah, I mean, he's an amazing man and he's great. And I've done a lot of work with him before. But there was a temptation to like relax and be like, okay, we're good. And so a lot of the work has been to say, no, we cannot relax. We cannot give up. I mean, indeed, those were John Lewis's last words to us in his eulogy that was printed. Like, you know, he left us with this letter at the end that says, you can't relax. You have to keep fighting. And so that's a lot of my work, is to continue to amplify that message, to say voting rights are under attack. Access to the ballot box is under attack. And the only way we can resist that is if we lift up a collective voice and really call on people of good faith and of conscience to step up and join us in this effort to provide access to the ballot box.
Thank you so much, Kim. This has just been, it's just been inspiring is the best word I can use. And there's several people on our chat who are very well versed in the life of Pauli Murray, but I know that there are many who really, this has been an opening for them, and that's what we are happy to do in the Episcopal Women's History Project, is open all women to know those women who came before and did such wonderful things for us, to help us to find out who we are and what our place is in the ministry that we are called to. So thank you once again, and we support you. We'll pray for you, and hope that we can turn some of this around. And before we leave, I would like to invite Robin Sumners to tell us about the talk she will be giving next week.
What is this little thing later? Okay. Next week, I'm going to do a presentation about my great aunt, whose name is Gertrude Sumners, who was born in 1900, and she was a missionary to Japan at a time when there was not a lot of enthusiasm for Christianity in Japan. And her story is very interesting. And personally for me, she was a very important person in my growing up within the Episcopal Church and how important that was for me. And her story is not, she's not well known. I don't think the people who went to Japan actually did get a lot of attention. And she was there twice. They sent her home during the Second World War. It took her 3 years to get home. I can tell you about that start. But she's a very interesting woman. And again, I think a woman, my family will probably have a heart attack over this, but we all think that perhaps she also was gay. She had a companion from Japan who stayed with her when she was dying, who came over from Japan. So I'll tell you about that too. So I have loved all of these things that we have had in this series of Lenten service. And we've especially pleased with Yane, who said, let's call it Women Worth Knowing, which I think has been so impressive from all of us. So thank you.
Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.